Let's talk a bit about price discrimination. Does charging different people different prices for the same product violate Kant's categorical imperative? The categorical imperative, after all, requires that we act according to maxims that we could will as universal laws. That means laws that would apply to everyone. But somebody who charges different people different prices for the very same product seems to violate that at first glance anyway. It looks as if they're taking people who are in a similar situation and treating them very differently. One way of thinking about Kant's principle is that we have to treat similar cases similarly. So people who are in similar situations should be charged similar prices, you would think. But sometimes, in fact really quite often, companies charge different classes of customers different prices. Now, in some cases, I think we'd all agree very quickly that that was immoral, that it was indeed a violation of Kant's categorical imperative. If a company charged customers of different races different prices, we would typically think that there's something wrong with that practice, that it constitutes an insidious form of racial discrimination. But other kinds of things happen all the time that at first glance look a bit similar. We might be tempted to think, well, the same should be true of other categories, for veteran status, for example, or for sex or sexual orientation, etc., etc. But it's common for hairstyling salons to charge men and women different prices. Is that unjust? Many people give discounts for veterans, or for senior citizens, or for students. Is that unjust? Airlines sell seats on airplanes. The seats are often pretty much indistinguishable unless you're seated in the middle. Nevertheless, people may pay very different prices depending on when they book their ticket. If the flight is relatively empty, the airline typically lowers its prices. If, on the other hand, the flight is quite full, prices go up. And something similar happens on Amazon and at other merchants. All you have to do is put some things in your cart and then watch and see some of the prices rise and some of the prices fall, depending upon factors like supply and demand. So somebody who buys it today may get a better price or a worse price than somebody who buys it tomorrow. Well, those kinds of things at first glance look like similar people are being treated very differently. So is there anything wrong with that? It's such a common practice that most of us don't even think about it. And in fact, when we get the discount for being a senior citizen or a student or a veteran or whatever, then we're tempted to say, that's great, and we're more likely to patronize that business. Well, if anything, that suggests that it's a pretty effective technique. Similarly with airlines, it makes perfectly good sense. You might say if there's high demand for a flight, to raise the price, and if there's low demand for a flight, to lower the price. So we might think there's nothing wrong with this. On the other hand, even if it makes good economic sense, does it make moral sense? Software companies often charge businesses more than they charge individual purchasers, and they often give a discounted price to academic institutions or to academics, that is, professors or teachers or students. And so those practices too, at first glance, seem to violate the categorical imperative. What about in general the practice of having sales? As soon as an item goes on sale, you might say, well, yeah, then it's a lower price than it was yesterday. When it goes off sale, it becomes a higher price. So somebody who is buying it on Tuesday may pay a very different price from the one that someone would pay on Wednesday. Final example. Colleges and universities routinely give scholarships to people on the basis of need or academic merit or a variety of other considerations. In effect, they are engaging in differential pricing. They are charging different people different prices for the same opportunity at a college education. That too looks at first glance as if it's violating Kant's categorical imperative. Should we understand the practice itself as immoral? Intuitively, I think, we think of some examples like this. For example, charging different people of different races very different prices. We tend to think that looks immoral, unjust, but we don't really mind if things go on sale. We think that's routine business practice. So how do we tell the difference? How do we tell when price discrimination is acceptable and when it's unacceptable? Before we go any further, let's define price discrimination. I've been talking about charging different people different prices for the same product. But of course, it's a little more complicated than that. Often, the products are not exactly the same. After all, the airline isn't selling you that exact same seat. They're selling you another seat on the airplane. And so you might say, well, they're very similar products. They're not exactly the same product. You might think it makes sense for the seat that's in the middle of the row to cost less than the one that's on the aisle or on the window. After all, they seem more desirable. Being stuck between two people may be a less desirable position. Maybe position on the airplane makes a difference too. The further up you are toward the front, the shorter a time it will take you to deplane, so there's an advantage to that. We could say the same thing is true of college educations. People will go to a college or a university. They will take different courses. They will end up, in some cases, with different degrees. They're similar products. They're not exactly the same. And a degree in chemical engineering may be worth quite a bit more on the market than a degree in social work. So we have to think carefully about what counts as a similar product and what therefore counts as different prices for different people for the same or similar products. Often economists define price discrimination in terms of marginal costs. The marginal cost of an item is what it would cost to produce one more. Now, that is different from the average cost of the item because, after all, you've got a large amount of overhead. You've got a factory maybe, or in the case of an airline or an airplane, in the case of a college or university, you've got all the buildings, the salaries of the various people involved, the staff, the faculty, the administrators, and so on. And so, how much does it cost the university to admit one more student? How much does it cost the airline to have one more passenger on the plane? Often, as in those cases, the marginal cost is very low, much lower than the average cost. After all, you might say, we have to pay these faculty members, these buildings, the staff members, the administrators, and so on. Having one more student doesn't really impose much of an additional cost. The same thing is true for filling up one additional airline seat. It doesn't really add to the cost to the airline to any significant degree to have one more person on the plane. In other cases, though, the cost of the raw materials of the product, of the actual act of producing it, is very considerable. And so in those cases, the marginal cost may be much closer to the average costs. Sometimes it might even be higher if it's easy to produce a certain number of these, for example, but requires people working overtime at higher cost to produce additional items. So the marginal cost, the cost of producing one more, can be quite different from the average cost, often much lower, but sometimes the same and sometimes even higher. Well, if we think about the ratio of marginal costs of two items, we can think about the price that people are being charged for them. And so some economists have defined price discrimination as a case where the prices being charged for items diverges from the ratio of their marginal costs. Now, I think that can be quite misleading, because after all, they may be differently priced because the average cost is so different. A good example involves pharmaceuticals. A huge amount of the cost of any drug that you might be prescribed by a doctor goes into research and development for that drug. And then the long approval process by the FDA. Producing one additional pill is usually quite inexpensive. So this is a case where the marginal cost is much lower than the average cost. So we have to think carefully about the sources here. It seems to me the difference in fixed costs, and therefore in average costs, is likely to show up in the price of items. It won't be reflected by the marginal cost difference among the items. So this can be misleading and can lead us to think there's discrimination in cases where there's not. So from here on, I'm going to largely ignore this definition and proceed as if we have a clear, intuitive idea of when people are discriminating in pricing and just trust us to understand what's a sufficiently similar product. Well, it looks as if price discrimination can arise and become a moral issue only if three conditions are satisfied. First of all, businesses must be able to identify what economists refer to as reservation prices, the highest price that a customer would be willing to pay. Why is it that software companies, for example, charge businesses more than they charge individuals? Because typically the business relies on that bit of software to a greater extent than the individual does. It's worth more to the business than it is to the individual. So the business is willing to pay a higher price than individual people generally are. And the same thing is true about the difference between the average customer and, let's say, the student or the faculty member. Why should there be a difference there? There's no difference in marginal cost, after all. producing one more bit of the software costs the same no matter who ends up getting it. But it may be that the student is just trying this out, they're just learning how to do it. They may decide they hate this and never want to use this piece of software again. And so the price they're willing to pay for it is lower than the average person who knows that this is a bit of software they want or need. Consequently, the reservation prices for these three groups are different. Businesses, in order to discriminate in price, to really have any motivation to discriminate in pricing, need to be able to figure that out. They need to be able to identify these reservation prices and tell, for example, that the reservation price of a business is higher than that of an individual, and of the average individual higher than that of a student. And so we can look at those kinds of differences and say, aha, the business charges these different prices because they can identify that difference. The second condition that has to be met is that there can't be competitors around who are not doing the same thing. If somebody else offers the same price to everyone, it's going to be hard for a company to maintain that price discrimination. Let's say, for example, that the software is selling for a price that is somewhere in between what would normally be charged to a business and what would be charged to an individual customer. Let's say that a company producing software engages in price discrimination. They charge businesses more than they charge individual customers, and individual customers more than they charge students. Then a competitor comes along and offers a similar product at the same price. For everyone, it's a price in between the individual price and the business price. What are people going to do? Well, the businesses are going to go for that alternative product. The students and the individuals are going to buy the first product because they don't want to pay the higher price for a similar product. And so very quickly, the attempted price discrimination there is going to fall apart. So in order to be motivated, the business has to be able to tell that certain classes of customers have different reservation prices. And then secondly, there must be no competition that isn't doing it. Otherwise, the scheme collapses because there's no way to really keep the high-paying customers on board. They'll go to the competition. Finally, it must be impossible to engage in arbitrage. What I mean there is buying as if you're a member of one class and selling as if you're a member of the other. So, for example, with a piece of software, the individual may buy the software and then sell it to businesses for some in-between price. Well, that's going to defeat the scheme too. So in order for price discrimination to exist sustainably as an equilibrium, it must be the case that businesses can identify the different reservation prices that different groups have. They must not face competition that is not engaging in price discrimination, and arbitrage must be impossible. Economists tend to argue that price discrimination is essential for an optimal allocation of resources. Why? Because of the phenomenon we've already talked about. A lot of items have low marginal costs, but relatively high average costs. Producing the next pill, for example, or the next copy of that software, or for that matter, having another student in the class, or having one more person fill up a seat on the airliner. That adds almost nothing to the cost of the business that is actually offering these things. But on the other hand, there's a large fixed cost. And in education, in pharmaceuticals, in software, in energy, in a wide variety of businesses, that's true. The marginal cost is really different from the average cost. So if people didn't engage in this sort of price discrimination, the business could not exist. There would be no way to finance those fixed costs. After all, it might be that the average customer can't really pay for the fixed costs, and so you've got to charge some customers more to pay for those fixed costs, and then you can offer others a price that is closer to the marginal cost price. Airlines couldn't exist, in short, if everyone were buying the discount seats. It's important that business travelers and first-class passengers are paying a higher fare. If they didn't, it would be hard for the airline to stay in business. Something similar happens with software. If people were not charging businesses more, then they would find it very difficult to justify the initial cost of producing the software. Something similar is true in pharmaceuticals. Somebody has to pay the higher prices that will justify the research and development needed to produce the drug. And if nobody does that, then the drugs are not going to be produced. This is why it becomes a political issue that people in certain countries, often the United States, for example, pay higher prices for pharmaceuticals than people in other countries do. It's a form of price discrimination. And you might think, wait, that's unfair. Why do Americans pay more than Danes, let's say, or Spaniards, or people in Asia or Africa for this particular pharmaceutical? The answer roughly is, first, we can afford to, and secondly, if we didn't, the drug would never be developed in the first place. There would be no financial incentive to do it. It's very inexpensive, once the thing has been developed, to produce additional quantities of the drug. But the initial development cost is big, and so there's a large investment up front. Many of those investments, by the way, don't pan out. The drug never turns out to be effective, and so on. So a lot of research and development goes into ideas that don't work out. Well, it would be great to say, well, don't invest in those, but there's no way in advance to tell which research projects are going to work out and which ones aren't. Consequently, it's important that some people are paying higher prices, and that's the economic argument in favor of price discrimination. If there were no price discrimination, a lot of products simply would not be available, and the result of that would be that those businesses would not even exist. What's the effect of price discrimination? Well, what it does is distribute income, in effect, from those with higher reservation prices to those with lower reservation prices. So those who are willing to pay more end up paying more of the cost. People who are willing to pay less do pay less. And so both groups get the product. They're willing to pay that much for the product. They're both happy. Well, nevertheless, they might look and say, but wait, I'm paying a lot more than that guy. Why is that okay? What justifies that price difference? If we think overall about distributive justice, we might be concerned about the morality of this on several grounds, but we might also attempt to justify it on several grounds. There's a utilitarian argument, which is basically that economic argument in favor of it. Look, everybody's better off as a result of that price discrimination. The products are offered, they wouldn't be offered otherwise. Everybody's lives are improved by the fact that it's possible to fly on an airplane, or take a drug to control blood pressure or whatever the ailment happens to be. And so these are things that make people's lives better. They wouldn't exist except for price discrimination. There are other ways of trying to justify this. If we're concerned about the welfare of the least advantaged, well then typically the poorer person is willing to pay less. They can afford to pay less. Price discrimination allows for those who can afford to pay more and carry more of the burden. Those who can afford to pay less get the product at a reduced price. And so you might say this redistributes typically, now not always, but typically from richer customers to poorer customers. John Rawls should be happy. Marx should be happy. It's meeting people's needs that might not otherwise be met. Rousseau should be happy. It is doing a bit of redistribution that should keep people within the margins that he thinks are required by the general will. Now this can be tricky. If we think about things in terms of reservation prices, we can think, well, what about items that go on sale? And go on sale to everyone. People presumably don't have different reservation prices on Tuesday than they have on Wednesday. So isn't that a phenomenon that is not covered by these considerations at all? Well, yes and no. You might think that that's a case where, look, the reservation prices haven't changed. However, that's not quite true. Some people are sale shoppers. They are not going to pay the regular price for that item, but they might well pay the sale price. And so they wait for the item to go on sale to purchase it. I do that all the time. At the grocery store, I tend to go in and I look at what's on sale. Do I want this or that for dinner this week? I largely decide in the store by saying, what's on sale this week? And so it's not something where I go in with a set list. I develop the list by looking at what's on sale. There may be other products that I'm interested in, but on the other hand, the regular price is a bit high. I'm not quite willing to pay that price. So I wait for the item to go on sale, and when it does, I jump in and purchase it. So sometimes I think it's true that sales actually are a way of engaging in price discrimination based on reservation prices. There are going to be certain people who are willing to buy the item on sale that would not be willing to buy it at regular price. Zwolinski argues that since everyone is better off as a result of the existence of price discrimination, we shouldn't think of it as any kind of moral problem. We've got to be careful, though, because presumably that argument might extend over a wide variety of cases. And so we've got to be sure that it's covering just the cases we want. Presumably, if we charge different prices to groups with the same reservation price, or even charge a higher price to a group with a lower reservation price, it seems as if we're doing something wrong. And that's true even if price discrimination in general is something that works out so that everyone is better off. That sort of price discrimination seems morally problematic. So it's important that we think in terms of reservation prices. Indeed, that's probably much more important than thinking about marginal costs and ratios of marginal costs. We also need to think about whether price discrimination is itself problematic. After all, maybe Kant's categorical imperative doesn't really apply to prices and to ordinary commercial transactions of this kind. Now, at first glance, you might think, well, that's odd. Come on, how can a whole sphere be exempt from moral considerations? We're going to talk a lot more about that next week. But the idea here would be, look, there are certain areas of life where we really don't think the categorical imperative applies. Similar cases have to be dealt with similarly. Well, do we really think that applies in a lot of personal connections? For example, when it comes to what to eat, or who to be friends with, who to date, who to marry, we tend to think that's up to your own individual choice. This relationship, it clicks. This one doesn't. And we don't really feel as if morality can then force us to become friends with this person or to give up our friendship with that person. Well, if that's right, maybe there are certain spheres where we simply say, moral considerations of this kind at any rate, these kinds of things based on Kant's categorical imperative, are really suspended in this sphere. Now, I think that's dangerous because presumably anybody can say, oh, well, in this sphere, we don't apply these kinds of considerations. But surely there are some spheres where we really think, look, in the end, it is just personal taste. Kant says that he's trying to get rid of subjective particular determinations, that he thinks that a rational and a moral person would decide purely on the basis of universal considerations, without any concern for particular and subjective factors. But wait a minute, we think lots of times it's perfectly okay to go with your own preferences, apart from any moral consideration. In effect, he's saying, look, your likes and dislikes, particular things that relate to that particular person or thing, as opposed to others, they don't count. They should be neglected from a moral point of view. But most of us are going to say, look, in certain areas of my life at least, that's ridiculous. It should matter whether I like the person, whether I like that particular food. If I say, but look, this has the same nutritional content, you can say, I'm sorry, I don't like it. And we don't think that that is thereby immoral. So we've got to be careful about just what those highly personal spheres of life really are. But maybe economic transactions, at least some kinds of economic transactions, might fall into that protected group. There are two other reasons why we might worry about applying the formula of universal law to all sorts of relationships. First of all is an argument from incommensurability. We say that similar cases have to be treated similarly. But what counts as a similar case? We've talked about issues involving pricing and that type of thing, or what counts as a similar product. But now I want to think about it from a slightly different point of view. Often people are making choices that really do seem hard to compare with one another. The utilitarian is inclined to think we can put everything on a single scale, but you might worry that that's really impossible. How do I compare two very different kinds of life? For that matter, how do I compare two different automobiles? I faced this a few years ago when I had to buy a new car. I was looking at a Mazda Miata and an Audi TT, both excellent cars. But the Audi TT, in this particular case that I was looking at, cost about twice as much as the Mazda Miata. How do I compare them? Well, they have many similar features. They're both convertibles. They were both delightful to drive. There was a significant price difference. The Audi let me put the top down just by pushing a button instead of actually, doing this kind of thing. And so there were some relevant differences. So one thinks about those and thinks, it's hard enough to come up with a comparison for those two automobiles, even though they're really very similar automobiles in a lot of ways. Now try to compare a small convertible like either one of those to a truck or an SUV, and already they're quite different. Now I tell you, well, yeah, you could buy a car, but on the other hand, you could just devote yourself to walking and taking the bus and use that money for something else completely differently. Use it for piano lessons, or use it to buy new furniture, or whatever it is that you might be interested in. How do you compare new furniture or piano lessons to an automobile? Well, they're so different that you might think, I don't know. In the end, yeah, I have to make a choice, so in a way I'm comparing them. But I don't know how to put them on the same scale. I don't know how to say that this many piano lessons is similar to, and therefore worth about as much as, that automobile, and so forth. So you might just worry that similar cases and similar treatment are so ill-defined that in a lot of cases we just can't compare things in different categories at all. The second argument is an argument based on the idea of leveling down. How do we actually apply the same rule to everyone? Well, one way of doing that is to scale things down. For example, the software company charges different prices for businesses, individuals, and students. Suppose they didn't do it. They said, well, we're just going to charge everybody the same price. It would, to justify the cost of producing the software, presumably have to be a relatively high price. Fewer copies are going to be sold, so the average price is going to be higher. Basically, the numerator will be pretty similar since the marginal cost is so low, and the denominator will be smaller. And so it's going to go up. So it's going to have to be a relatively high price. Well, now the businesses will still pay it, but it means individuals and students aren't going to buy it at all. That hurts them, of course. So the only way that the business can really thrive and succeed may be to lower that price. But then, at a lower price, it may not make any economic sense to produce the software at all. And we can apply that across the board. If you seek equality, whether it's equality of outcomes, or equal treatment, or equal pricing in this case, or a variety of other things like that, there is pressure to lower things down. Lower things to the level of the person who, in this case, can afford and is willing to pay that price for the product. In other contexts, that leveling down may be different and may be quite serious. But what can happen then is that some people end up worse off as a result of this, and nobody really ends up better off. So the leveling down is a scary thing. If we say, look, there's inequality here, we solve it by lowering the level so that everybody is at the same low level. It may well be that nobody is actually better off as a result of that, and some people who get leveled down are significantly worse off. Now, whether that would result in a particular economic case or not is something tricky. It depends on the details of the case. It depends on the reservation prices, on the fixed costs, on the marginal costs, so it's a complicated question. It won't always apply, but it will sometimes apply, and so the result of that might be that trying to apply the same rule across the board has a negative effect on some people and really no positive effect